Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve Berg. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Today's topic is humility, but it is actually more than that. It's also agility, corporate culture, continuous learning, and the innovation process. In fact, all of these things are conjoined to the quality of humility. Intuitively, humility is a quality that people want to find in almost all the people we interact with on a daily basis. What people may not recognize is that humility is part and parcel of agility, and that agility is a key ingredient in the startup recipe for innovation. The recognition of this while researching the work for our guest today is what makes me very excited for the upcoming conversation. Jeff Gothelf is an author, speaker, and organizational designer for technology, software, and internet companies. I'm going to be speaking to him primarily about the material in his book, Sense and Respond, how successful organizations listen to customers and create new products continuously. Hi, Jeff. I omitted a whole bunch of interesting things about lean UX and your work history. Could you fill in some of the blanks for the people?
Sure, Steve. Thanks so much for having me. My background is in design. I was a software designer for the first half of my career. I spent 10 years in the first .com wave, and then beyond that, building software products, websites, and as the web became more interactive products and services. And then in the last 10 years or so, moved more into team leadership and product strategy and product management. The interesting thing is that about 8 years ago or so, I was set at a task to build a new design team in an organization that was becoming increasingly agile. The tech team in that organization, and it was a high-growth startup, was transitioning from a traditional waterfall development model to an agile model. And my job was twofold. One was to build a design team within that organization, and second, make that design team work with this new agile engineering practice. Back then, there was no good answer to this problem. Building design teams, sure, no shortage of material there, but actually finding material that said, here's how design and agile work well together, it was a trail of tears. And if you Googled it, it was really like, this sucks, these things shouldn't be together, it's the wrong approach. And so I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to research and experiment and try to figure out how to bridge the gap between a user-centric design process and an agile engineering practice. And in doing so, my team and I found a solution that worked for us in our context. We called it Lean UX, and we started talking about it and started blogging and speaking at conferences about it. That turned into a book. The book really changed both the trajectory of the work that I was doing and the kinds of companies that I was working with at the time. So whereas before people were hiring me to design software products, now that the book became popular and provided a solution to this agile design problem, people were hiring me to come in and teach them how to do what we did at this company where we figured this out. And so I've spent really the last 5 or 6 years building a coaching and training and workshop business, initially as part of a company called Neo. That was a consulting company that I helped found, and then ultimately now on my own, to help companies bridge the gap between product management, agile engineering, and modern design of software products. And that's really where I've been spending the bulk of my time, working with a lot of companies, teaching them how to do that work.
So you literally built the roadmap, and now essentially you're the guide.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, I'm the Lean UX guy, yeah, for sure. And it's become a really interesting shift in the way that I work. And while I do miss designing actual products, I feel like these days I design organizations, I design teams, and to some extent I hope that at the very least I have influence on the design of cultures.
Perfect. All right. I'd like to start out with the why of this discussion. You tell a great story about the human cannonball at a circus where you worked, and we'll leave the, why you worked at a circus for maybe later in the discussion. Could you, one, tell the story, and two, through the story, explain why technologists need humility to sense and respond?
Yep. So my first job out of college was with the circus, a traveling circus, an East Coast circus. And I spent 6 months on the road doing shows up and down, essentially I-95. And you meet a lot of interesting people, as you might imagine, working in the circus. This was a fairly old and very traditional circus, and so we had a human cannonball, kind of seemingly a very traditional circus thing to have. And the interesting thing about it is, while we were full-time circus employees on the road full-time, there's a ton of downtime when you're on the road with the circus. We do 2 shows a day, 3 shows on Saturdays, but once the shows are over, you're on your own. And sometimes we're in the middle of nowhere, in a parking lot or in a field, so you start talking to your colleagues. One of the guys I befriended that summer was the human cannonball. And as these things kind of happen, you kind of have to ask, how does one become the human cannonball, right? Because it's not like a LinkedIn path to this. There's no CV.
There's got to be, there's going to be a good story.
Right. And as these things kind of, as you might imagine, the story of how this guy became the human cannonball starts with the previous human cannonball. And so the story goes like this. There was a human cannonball before this guy. And the way that the human cannonball the cannon worked, it's this big silver cannon on a red truck. And they drive it into the big top. And they aim it, and the human cannonball slides into it. The ringmaster pushes a button. There's a little puff of smoke, and a little bang. And a spring launches the guy across the big top, and he lands in a net on the other side. Now, the way that they know where to put the net is pretty basic. Every time we got to a new lot, they set up the big top, they pull the truck into the tent, they aim the cannon, and then they put a mannequin or a dummy in it that weighed the same as the previous human cannonball.
What could possibly go wrong here?
What could possibly go wrong, right? And they fire it, right? And wherever that dummy lands is where they put the net. Now, for years, this worked without fail, right? They would fire the dummy, they put the net up, the guy gets in, waves goodbye, they fire him off, and he lands there, and that's his gig, right? 2 minutes per show, 4 minutes a day. It paid really well, right? Not a bad gig. So one night was different with the previous human cannonball, right? The circus was running late. The truck with the cannon showed up late. And they didn't have time to set up and test the night before. And so they said, okay, we'll do it in the morning. And they left the dummy out overnight, and it rained that night. The next day, same as they had done day in and day out for years leading up to this particular day, they load the dummy in the cannon, they fire it, they see where it lands, they put the net up. That afternoon, in front of 4,000 kids, the previous human cannonball gets in the cannon. We laugh now, but it's not really a funny story.
Clearly he wasn't smart enough to dunk himself in water first. But
right.
Oh well.
You kind of see where this is heading. He waves goodbye to 4,000 kids. The ringmaster hits the button. It sends him flying, and he sails way past the net. Way past, right? And so it's actually a tragic story, right? The guy ends up critically injured. He doesn't die, critically injured, and he goes back to Florida to recuperate. Florida is where all circuses come from, in case you didn't know.
I didn't know.
You're probably not surprised to hear that, but it's true. Florida is where kind of the home of all the circuses. And he goes back to Florida to recuperate. In the meantime, while he's recuperating, he sees his pool boy. His pool boy is kind of this all-American football player, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kind of guy. He says, hey, do you want a promotion? Essentially, from pool boy to human cannonball, you work 4 minutes a day, you make a bunch of cash, and sure enough, that's how this guy becomes the human cannonball. So that's the story of how he became the human cannonball. Now, why is this relevant to our conversation, other than being a kind of fun story to tell and interesting, is that the previous human cannonball and his team made a set of assumptions, right? That the same thing would work day in and day out. And for years it did, and it made them successful. And then one day, something changed. And they just assumed that because they'd been right all along, they'll continue to be right moving forward. And in a particular case, they were tragically wrong. In our world, in the technology world, our assumptions need to be tested far more regularly than when a tragic event happens, because the pace of change, in the circus, the pace of change is very slow. I can tell you that from experience. In technology, the pace of change is incredibly fast, and it's continuous. It doesn't abate, right? And so just because we've been successful to a certain point, just because we've built a successful business either now or in the past, or we've gotten some traction in one market and we're trying to expand that, it does not mean that what got us here will get us to the next place there. And so the humility component comes in here to say, look, we know this has been good for us, but there are a bunch of unknowns moving forward. Let's just make sure that we have baked some kind of continuous learning practice into the way that we work. And if we find out that the things that have gotten us here don't make sense, don't apply, aren't true anymore, then let's have the humility to change course.
So, I would think beyond the fact that it worked every day, what companies do is they build up kind of pride and they build up stubbornness. Like, hey, this has worked. It's going to keep working. Even when the circumstances tell them that they might need to alter it, they have 5 years of data that says they shouldn't.
Right.
And so I think that also kind of, unless you're actually consciously building in a component, and I want to steal thunder, of course, that is going to become an impediment to evolution, right?
So, yeah, success is the enemy of humility,
for sure,
right? Because hey, look how successful we are,
right?
Which means we're smart and good at this. Right. So I don't need to learn anymore. Like I'm good.
We've made a lot of money. We're going to continue to make a lot of money.
Right.
All right. So you've espoused some principles that really should be at the heart of continuous development organizations and in the mind of entrepreneurs. Let's talk through them. The first one is customer value equals business value.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me that in the 21st century, that this is not the mantra for every business. So what I mean by this is that if we solve real problems for real customers in a meaningful way that doesn't waste their time, that delights them when there's an opportunity to do so, they will reward us. They will continue to buy products and services from us. They will tell their friends. They will spread the word for us, right? They will reliably try out anything new that we put into the market. And yet, most companies start off this way. They'll say, okay, who's the customer that we're solving for? What's the problem? And then they start building software. And then they kind of forget about that whole customer problem they were solving, and it gets into this combination of an arms race with features. So let's just get features out there because somehow that makes us more valuable, and this mindset that, well, we've got to increase the efficiency of producing those features, never stopping to check whether there's actually any customer value in making those features. And the genesis of that is the manufacturing, kind of the industrial era manufacturing mindset, where there was very little risk or uncertainty in the thing that you were making, right? Once you kind of hashed out the thing that you were going to churn out of your factory, whether it's, let's just say it's a fork, right, for example, right? Let's say your factory makes forks. You know exactly what's going into that fork. You know what it costs to make it. You know what you could probably sell it for, what your profit margin is. And you have a pretty good sense of what people are going to do with that thing once you ship it. And so your job in a manufacturing capacity there is to reduce the cost and maximize your margin on that. But we're making software. We're not making forks. We're not making physical things. And software has a tremendous amount of uncertainty baked into it, not the least of which are humans, people, right? And that's where your customers come in. So just because you think you know what it should look like and how it should work and why it should be there, you can't predict what your customers will actually do with it. And you see this time and time and time again with features, people using technology to do something it was never designed to do, or hacking systems to achieve what they actually need that system to do. And so the more that as a business you can stay in tune with your customers and what's actually delivering value to them, the more you can adjust the continuous software service that you're shipping out there. And that's humility, right? That's humility that says, look, I have a good sense, I have a strong opinion about what this should be, but in the face of evidence and in seeing what customers actually do with my product and service, I'm willing to change my mind.
So before we started recording, you told me a story about a company, and that company in particular was kind of using their software to almost hold their customers captive. And without getting into the names of it, I was really shocked at the notion that they were not assuming that customer value equals business value. They were saying, hey, we need to protect our business, and we really don't care what the customer thinks about it. And that ultimately forced the customers to go someplace else to try and get a solution that was completely different. I couldn't help thinking, and maybe I'm answering my own question, I couldn't help thinking that if that particular company had embraced customer value equals business value, they'd be, one, ingratiating themselves into customers, and two, they would have solved the problem much sooner before it was a little problem before it became a big problem.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see this because the company we talked about is an example of a much broader situation that we find ourselves in. Any company that's making any kind of hardware, consumer hardware, commercial hardware, whatever it is, has technology baked into it. And that technology makes those tools better, more efficient, and it ultimately makes the users more successful at whatever it is they're trying to do. And in doing so, this often means that people end up buying less stuff from these manufacturers, particularly hardware manufacturers. And so what that means is that these hardware manufacturers are left looking for other sources of revenue. And that typically ends up in some kind of a services revenue. And the technology then becomes the linchpin around which that services revenue channel hangs on. And the more that they can control that, in other words, control their customers and lock them in to these ecosystems, the more in charge they are, the more predictable the revenue becomes. And that becomes, again, business value overtaking customer value.
That's the paradox.
Yep.
All right. So the second principle is value learning over delivery.
Yeah, and so this really speaks to that manufacturing mindset again. So most companies that I work with manage their teams, and if we're talking about sort of agility and agile and kind of as the core philosophy that most companies are using to drive their software development efforts, they're managing their teams to what's called velocity. Right? Velocity is the measure of productivity, and it's typically measured by how much code you can get out in a sprint. And usually that's a week or 2 weeks, generally speaking. The value that the organization places on delivery trumps everything else. And in fact, that's what people get incentivized for, is to ship more features. And as we kind of talked about earlier, simply making more software doesn't make you more successful. You've got to make the right software, and it's got to be designed and implemented well. And so that's where learning comes in. It's figuring out not just how to ship high-quality, bug-free code in a predictable way, but which code should we ship, and how should it be designed, and what copy should go into it, and where should we optimize the code for efficiency, and where does it matter less, right? Because we've got a finite number of people to do this amount of work. So then how do you start to build learning into your software creation process? And again, the biggest trade-off here is that word velocity. So most software teams say, well, we can get this much code out in a 2-week sprint. And then as soon as you start to introduce any kind of learning activity, and specifically I'm talking about talking to your customers, running an A/B test, building some kind of an MVP or an experiment that tests out a new feature, anything like that, observing customers in the wild, doing the thing that your product helps them do better. As soon as you introduce any of those kind of features, the velocity of delivery comes down. And that is unacceptable, right, for most organizations, because all of a sudden, well, we're making less stuff. That means we're not working as hard. We're not as productive or as efficient, right? And the reality is that what you're actually doing is that you're informing the delivery process so that when you do start making software and code, you're making the right code, and it's well designed, and it's usable, and it creates delight, and it solves real problems for customers. And so building in that learning capacity and then maintaining it is crucial to building great software-based services.
So as you're explaining that, I was just thinking into my head, like, let's say I could say 1,000 words per minute. And if I said 1,000 words per minute, it would seem like I ought to be able to say a lot.
Right.
Right? But truth of the matter is I'd probably really be saying nothing.
Right.
So what you're saying is, why don't you say fewer words per minute and say something important?
Right. And find out what your audience wants to hear.
Right.
Right. So the time that you would have spent saying those extra 300 words, let's say you cut it down to 700 words, right? Take the time you'd spend saying those 300 words and just find out what your audience wants to hear, right? Probably be more successful.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, third principle is radical transparency.
Yeah, this is the key. This is the key to building that learning culture. And I'll give an example. So there was a company I worked with here in New York for a long time that grew exponentially. So they were a startup. They grew from the founder's living room to 400 people at its peak, and then some. The thing that struck me the most, when I joined that company, I was somewhere in the 180s, in the employee 180 something, and I came from a big organization. I worked primarily in large organizations coming into that, where there was no transparency. Right? You were told what to do. You could ask why, but you never got a good answer. And I was struck by the level of candor and openness in this startup. Every week, we'd have, Monday morning, there was a meeting, an all-hands meeting. The entire company, 180, 200 people would get together. We'd talk about the metrics, what's working, what's not, what our goals are for the week. Maybe we'd identify or show off something that went well in the past week, and then we'd go to work. And if you missed that presentation, it was always available, and it gave you a sense, and you can go back and kind of check the numbers. And that transparency, as an employee, that bought me in to the mission of the company. That bought all of us into a shared goal and a shared understanding of what we were trying to do. And it opened up, it kind of demystified, at 180 people even, which is not a huge company, but even at 180 people, you don't know everybody by first name. Right? It started to demystify who's who and who's doing what, and it created this open door policy that allowed me, as at the time a designer, then a design leader, and then a product leader in that company, to know who to go to and start to ask questions. It's that transparency that builds trust. And when we trust each other, we're much more amenable to admitting to each other when we're wrong. And so we build these learning loops, and we're not always right. In fact, we're usually wrong the first couple times out. Right? Now, if your organization is transparent, people know each other, they trust each other, they have a shared goal, it's a lot easier for me to come to you as my boss or as my peer or as a colleague and say, listen, that thing I thought was awesome, it actually was terrible. Here's how I found out, and we should really do something else. Now, I'm not going to get fired for that. In fact, I'm going to be praised or rewarded for that, for finding that out quickly, as opposed to waiting 9 months and then finding out that the thing we shipped didn't actually work. And so the more that we can be open about what we're doing, what's working, and what's not working, and again, this speaks to humility, right? Because it's an open admission that I was wrong, and that's okay. And I learned something from that, and we're going to change course and move that forward. And it underpins the ability to build continuous learning into the way that you build products and then ultimately companies.
So the reason this is so fascinating for me, we spoke in a different episode to Kim Scott, who wrote the book Radical Candor. Mm-hmm. And what you're doing right now, maybe unbeknownst to you, is you're tying all of these things together, all of these other people. And it's just, it gives me confidence that these things are the right things when I hear them from different places and, they're being espoused in different ways. Interestingly, it also brings us to the fourth topic or principle, which is central to everything else we're talking about, which is humility. And we've said it a number of times, but I think it kind of bears having its own little discussion. Humility equals agility.
Absolutely. So the ability to admit that you were wrong. So my favorite way to put this, and I learned this from a colleague of mine from years ago named Janice Frazier. She said this, she said, strong opinions loosely held. And I love that phrasing, right? Because humility doesn't mean I don't know anything or that I don't have a strong opinion about how we should solve a problem for our business or for our customers. It just means that in the face of evidence, I'm willing to let that opinion go. and move on to the thing that I've just learned. And that's the key in all of this, because if you're willing to move on, then you're willing to be agile as an organization. And that's the toughest part, right? And I think you see that with a lot with founders, right? Founders, they have to be tenacious, right? And they kind of have to be a little crazy, if you will, because they've got this vision and this dream, and no one's going to shake them off their dream. And I get that, right? But the evidence that you collect as you build learning loops in pursuit of that vision will inevitably adjust the tactics and perhaps even the strategy that you have for achieving that vision. And that's being agile, right? Forget the religion, capital A, that you hear a lot about, right? It's about thinking through kind of why we're doing this, and then being willing to kind of adjust the path to get there. And if you're not, what happens is the people who work with you and the people who work for you inevitably start to see that rigidity, right? That lack of agility. And at some point, they're going to get frustrated and they're going to keep saying, look, everything is telling us that this direction is wrong. Everything is continuously telling us that we're wrong. And and as a founder, right, if you keep rejecting that, people will leave inevitably.
So you must be reading my mind, because that's a perfect segue into the next question. So if we have a founder that actually embraces the principles that we've talked about, which is customer value equals business value, value learning over delivery, radical transparency, humility equals agility. If you embrace these, in your experience thus far, what kind of impact would you expect to see on the culture and the mindset of the organization?
I think the most meaningful impact that can come out of adopting these points of view is how we measure success and how we incentivize the people that work for us. And that will define the culture, right? So if we get out, if we kind of assume for a second that we're not micromanaging our people, although maybe we shouldn't, but there's a level of trust and transparency, right? That says, look, here's what I want you to do. As an organization, right, we're going to measure success based on these measures of customer behavior. Right? Because our goal is to solve a customer problem, a real problem for a real customer, hopefully, right? And we'll know that we're successful when we see these measurable changes in our customers' behavior, right? And we set those goals as organizational goals for the year, for the quarter, for a half year, whatever it is, right? And then we incentivize our teams to achieve those goals, instead of incentivizing our teams to ship specific bits of software or features or products. And then what we do is we let those teams figure out what the best combination of code, copy, and design and marketing will achieve the outcomes that we've set as our measures of success. And what that does is it builds that learning culture almost implicitly, right? Because I haven't told you what to go make. All I said was, I want you to get more people coming to the site and signing up for an account, right? Or whatever it is, right? Or I want you to increase the basket size at checkout by 50%, something along those lines. Now, it's your job to figure out how to do that. It's my job as the leader to guide you and provide feedback. Like, for example, you might come up with 10 different ideas, and it's my job to say, those 4 are off-brand, right? That's kind of not on our vision. Let's pursue a couple of these over here. But what it does is it changes the way that people think about work. It changes why they're doing certain things, and it forces them to learn. And as soon as they start to learn, they're going to find out that they're wrong. And if they find out that they're wrong, they're going to have to share that information. So we start to build that transparency and that humility. So it's really all about how you measure success and how you set incentives if you adopt this way of working, right? Because the self-organization will come out of this. Ultimately, people, especially if you're hiring smart people, like they know how to design, right? Or they know how to write code, or they know how to be good product managers, assuming, right? But putting them together in an environment that allows them to explore and learn together really drives that humility and that agility.
Does this touch on or overlap with a notion that you talked about of a deliberate mindset versus an emergent mindset? Is that part and parcel of this, or is that something slightly different?
It is actually. So that's it's a key point we make in the book, right? So and this is I think, I don't know a ton of founders, but the founders that I have met generally, certainly in the early days of their company, operate with a deliberate mindset. A deliberate mindset is this point of view that says, I am the leader, I am the creative one, I have determined the vision for this, I know exactly what needs to happen, what it needs to look like, and how it needs to work. I will convey that to my team. Please go forth and execute. Right? And even if you hire good people, they will execute, and they will do a good job executing on your vision. Right? But there's no guarantee that your vision is right, and in all likelihood, it's probably wrong to some extent. Now, an emergent mindset simply says, look, we are going to start to build some kind of a system, and we're going to start to see what kind of feedback and usage emerges from that system. So again, it's that strong opinions loosely held. I have a strong opinion about this service. Okay, let's build V1 of that service. Okay, based on whatever feedback and insight we have. And now let's see what happens once we start to launch kind of the early phase 1, MVP, whatever version of it. Now, immediately, customers will start to break your mental model, right? They'll start to break that deliberate vision that you had about what your thing should do. And things will start to emerge from the usage of the system that you then need to decide what you want to do with as a founder and as the leader of that business. I think the most famous, or perhaps well-known example of this is the hashtag, right? Twitter didn't invent the hashtag, right? And a user invented the hashtag to track conversation, and it got widely adopted, and Twitter then kind of let it emerge, and it took it in as a legitimate feature over time, and now they've monetized it, right? You can advertise against hashtags and that type of thing, right? So that's kind of a famous example of something that emerged from the usage of the system that wasn't divined by Jack or Ev or Biz or anybody, right? And really taken to heart by the company, and then used ultimately to make them more successful.
Right. So, because this podcast is about intangible qualities that drive success, I'm going to ask you to kind of lean on your observations and experience for a second. When we think of founders, entrepreneurs that do embrace some of these qualities, humility, tangentially agility, what kind of other traits have you seen in these types of folks? I'm just going to throw out one that may or may not be right. I would imagine you need to be an open-minded individual, for example, to embrace humility.
Right. So curiosity, right? Open-mindedness, curiosity is the key trait here. It's this belief that we're always learning. And again, I'll point back for a second to the Agile lexicon, but there's a good term there called the beginner's mind, right? Approaching everything with a beginner's mind, where I assume I don't know everything, and that I'm willing to learn. I think that's one. I think the other is the ability to collaborate and delegate. And I think this is again an example of humility that says, look, I'm an excellent software engineer, and I've had a great product idea. But guess what? I'm not a good designer. I'm not a good product person, or I'm not a good salesperson, right? So I'm going to bring in some folks who can complement my core skill sets and make us more successful, right? So it's that curiosity and a recognition of your own limits. I think that helps, and then obviously the ability to work with those people as well, because that's the other side. Is you can say, okay, I know I'm not good at operations, right? I used to work with a founder who was like this amazing visionary, right? But we needed to get paychecks every 2 weeks, right? Guy couldn't make it happen, right? So we brought in a COO, right? And those guys collaborated well. But if they didn't, like if they couldn't delegate, if the CEO couldn't delegate to the COO, that would have been highly problematic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would think also that, we've talked about how you let data and feedback drive your actions going forward. I would think also somebody who is data, kind of mentally data-driven, back to the strong ideas loosely held, right? Okay. Yep. So let's think about it from the other side, all right? You've got a founder and a leader, but that, as you're mentioning, that in order to execute, that founder or leader needs employees and team members. I would imagine that the qualities associated with the team members and the type of people that you're looking to hire when you're building your organization would be different, right? They would have different skills and abilities. Maybe we could spend a little time, if you've got a thought on this, explaining what kinds of team members you're looking to hire and how you go about finding those guys and making sure that they do have those things that you're looking for before you sign on the dotted line.
Yep. So let me share with you an anecdote about a software developer that I've been fortunate enough to work with a few times here in New York, and why we kept hiring him. Kind of every next company, next opportunity, we kept hiring him. And it really paints a good picture of the kind of person that you want. And this is an example of a software engineer, but apply this to product manager, designer, marketer, whatever it is. We were working on a small business initiative for one of the large financial services companies here in town. And on his way to work, so he's the guy writing code for this small business initiative. Now, on his way commuting into the city every day, he walks past delis, dry cleaners, nail salons, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He would stop in and talk to the owners on his way home from work or on the way to work, and just ask them questions about the project that we were working on, because we were building a system for them. We didn't ask him to do this. It wasn't, it was off hours. It wasn't part of an official learning activity. He was just naturally curious, and he wanted to do a better job writing the best possible code. In other words, creating the best possible experience for these small business owners, and he didn't know them. Like he didn't really understand their world, but he walked past them every single day, and certainly he was a customer of theirs. And so he just popped in, and he'd talk about, how do you guys do social media marketing? How do you even know what that is, right? Where do you typically do your marketing? And he would just do that, depending on what we were working on in the system. He would just pop in on the way in and the way out and get that feedback. That's the kind of person that you're looking for. Right. To build this kind of culture.
Yeah. He wanted to get in their shoes a little bit in order to be able to produce something that they could find value in.
To do a better job.
Yeah.
He wanted to do a better job, and he recognized that delivering customer value allowed him to do that, regardless of the fact that he was, hip deep in the ones and zeros, right? It still was important to him to understand the human side of this.
Right. All right. And then the third kind of audience in terms of the investor-founder relationship, and I'm going to be a little bit clunky about this question, so bear with me while I try and get it out. The right type of investors is what I'm getting at. And the reason for the question is, it occurs to me that in an emergent mindset, there's a real opportunity for the company to run out of resources. I mean, for example, capital, which, in venture capital terms really means time. And to me, that means pressure. And that may not necessarily be conducive to some of the principles around continuous learning and wait and see and figure it out and, feedback. So what do you think are the right types of investors for these guys? Are they long view type folks, or are they just deep pocketed, or are they completely trusting? I don't know.
Look, I think that, again, this is about redefining success. So as an investor, looking at what is a successful company, or what is a potentially successful investment opportunity for me, is really driven by how these teams are framing what they're doing, how they're framing the work. Is it framed in customer value? Is it framed in features? Right? And I think as an investor, you want to look for the companies that truly understand their market. Right? And you see this in the most successful companies in the world. Bezos' annual shareholder letter always talks about his obsession with customers, without fail. This year's particularly, but every year. He talks about his obsession with customers, understanding everything that they're doing, why they care about this, and then there is an opportunity, I think, to change the nature of the conversation that investors and their portfolio companies have, where maybe the conversations happen more frequently, and maybe they're not necessarily so business focused or feature focused, but they're really more about outcome focused. Now, ultimately, yes, those outcomes need to lead to some kind of financial results, right? And we can tie those in, right? So revenue. Right? What drives revenue? Guess what? Customer behavior drives revenue. Well, which customer behavior? Well, let's talk about that. Because currently there's 15 different kind of behaviors we could optimize for. We have 6 people on the team. Right? So we're going to optimize for these 3. Here's why. And the next time we check in with you, we'll let you know how the progress is going to that and whether or not we think we're going to move over there as well. The other opportunity, I think, too, and I tell this to the enterprise companies that I work with in thinking through how to build kind of funding models for their, not just their innovation work, but their actual just day-to-day work as well, is maybe to kind of allocate a sum of money to an investment for a period of time, but really have the portfolio company prove that they've kind of earned the next bit of that funding, this quarter's worth, or the next 6 months worth of that funding, based on their traction towards changing these customer behaviors. And I think that's the conversation really is how do you measure success, and ultimately how intimately familiar are these folks with their customers and continue to be? Because I do believe that founders initially have done their market research and they're like, okay, this is the total addressable market size and all of that, right? They've done that, but how many customers have you actually talked to? My friend Tomer Sharon, who's the director of UX over at WeWork, he wrote a second book about validating product ideas, and he talked to 200 founders in that process. And I think it was like 175 roughly of them, when he asked them, who did you talk to get a sense that this was a good idea? It was like 85% said, well, I talked to my spouse, I talked to my partner, I talked to my mom, and they all loved it, right? And that was it, and that was the end of it, right? And so that, and then they just started building, and I think that's hugely risky for a VC, right? For an investor to see a company that's building without any kind of evidence, without any kind of learning, that would be a red flag for me.
So that's, as an enterprise investor, that's, I think, excellent advice. So then the kind of tangential question I have associated with that is, all right, so I might meet a founder maybe half a dozen times before I have to make an investment choice. And I need to recognize this humility in him or her. Do you have any hints or guidance for me about how I can know that these intangible qualities are there?
That's a great question. To really feel this stuff, I think you see it in their presentations. I think you see it in their presentation style. I would ask them, tell me about the last time you were wrong about something, right? Tell me about a recent time you found out you were wrong, right? I think that's a really interesting question to ask somebody because it forces them to really think about when they change their mind. Tell me about the last time you changed your mind about something. Why did you change your mind? Right? And I think that becomes a really interesting conversation and see what comes out of that. And I'd be curious to see if you use those questions, if you get good results out of them.
Yeah, I'll tell you that we try to do that, and it's much more about how they process that and answer the question than what they actually change their mind on.
Right.
Okay. That's the prepared questions that I had for you. Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to discuss that I may have missed? Maybe you want to tell how you ended up as a carny. I don't know. Anything that you would like to add?
Sure. Two things. I'll tell you how I ended up in the circus. But I did want to come back to your note earlier about how some of the conversations we're having in this discussion, we're stitching together some of these other concepts. That's exactly what we set out to do when we wrote Sense and Respond. So Josh Seiden and I, second book we've written together, and the focus of that book was really to create a synthesis of a lot of the big business and management ideas that are currently flying around, right? So agile and lean startup and radical candor and culture and all of these things, without getting bogged down in dogma or philosophy or like really deep recipes, but really kind of synthesizing this approach. So I'm glad you called that out, and I really wanted to echo that. Is that really the focus is that there is no recipe for success here. There's a lot of great ideas out there, and if you can kind of pick and choose the combination that work for you in your investment practice, in your startup, in your company, whatever it is, right, you can really knit together a great culture. And so I'm glad you called that out.
Perfect. Where can the people listening to this podcast find you?
So I'm on Twitter a lot. My Twitter handle there is JBoogie. The story there is take these services seriously when they first pop up, which I didn't. I've been on Twitter for 10 years, and when it first came out, I was like, I'll just make up a name. And I was listening to a lot of Lauryn Hill at the time, and she was referring to herself as L Boogie. I was like, all right, well, I'll be J Boogie, I guess. And you kind of get stuck with it after a decade of using that.
I knew there was a story about that.
Yeah, so Twitter's good, J Boogie. Obviously, the books are on Amazon, and then you can hop over to my website. It's gothelf.co is the easiest URL to get there. gothelf.co.
Perfect. Let's end here. Thank you very much for your time and your insight. This was really helpful, and I enjoyed it a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, who has been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve Berg.